welcome everybody. Really a joy to be with you all tonight. I'm so happy that we can have a chance to get together in this way. It's really a joy for Patty and I to be able to do so. I thought we could just start out and just, we'll just check in directly. How about that? So we're just seeing what is already present when we're not trying to make something else happen. So we could call this checking in with our, let's call it the ground of being tonight. So just what we essentially are. We're not trying to be something else. So to do that, we can just set aside anything that pulls us away from that, okay? So any sense of wanting something to be different than it is right now. Little things, big things. We can pick them up later, but just for the next few minutes here, we'll just set aside anything that is pulling us away from this moment, this space, this presence. So any problem that we are cultivating, nurturing, trying to solve, it'll be there in, an hour from now. But for right now, we can just set that aside, and just acknowledge that, okay, maybe we won't use this next hour and a half to try to resolve that. So we'll just put that aside. We're not denying it. We're not trying to make it go away. We're just going to set it aside for a little bit here. We could sense into any desires that we're holding for things to be better, more exciting, more peaceful. Anything having to do with that sense of more, and anything having to do with a sense of more implies a perceived lack of something here now. Something here now is not quite sufficient, but if it were more like this, then maybe it would be fine. So we're just, that whole sense, that whole movement away from what is, what's present now, we'll just set that one aside. Any ambition that we might be carrying. Oh, I don't know, let's just say for enlightenment or a quiet mind or peace or anything that's other than this moment. So any sense of ambition, gaining something that's not present now, and just set that aside. Any grudges, any unforgiveness that we might be holding, maybe subtly, maybe in the back of our heads that, arises from time to time. Anybody that in our entire life that we haven't quite gotten around to forgiving, and just set that aside. Set that aside for future investigation, but for right now, we'll just set it aside. Any regrets? Little ones, big ones, regrets about, how our life turned out. Any judgment about how it should have been or shouldn't have been. Any sense of something shouldn't have happened, something unfair happened to me. Any sense of regret. Set aside any sense of guilt or shame, any sense of self-judgment in that way. We set aside any sense of limitation, any way we perceive ourselves to be limited by anything, right? Limited by our health, limited by our, I don't know, physical appearance, limited by our mental capacities, limited by our, emotional frailties, whatever. Any sense of identification with any kind of self-limitation. Again, we're not trying to deny anything. We're not trying to make anything go away. We're just gently setting it aside as something impermanent and seeing what's left, right? So anything that's impermanent, in other words, comes and goes, it's not always in the forefront of our mind. Anything that's impermanent, almost by definition, can't be who we fundamentally are. Who we are in its essence can't come and go. What would it be when it goes? Right? Some alternative universe or we can also set aside any hope. I hope something will be different tomorrow. It may be. That's fine. Things always do change. But that hope that somehow it will be different, obviously better, right? is sort of a diminishment of whatever it is that we're here now, whatever essence is here now. We can let go of any kind of sense of I have to do something or I have to stop doing something. We can set aside any sense of I have to earn being what I fundamentally am. Any sense of merit, right? Any sense of I may not be qualified now, but if I do some things that I've been told or believe, then I'll be qualified. Set aside any, just for now, just set aside any beliefs, opinions, ideas, concepts, anything of a mental origin, anything where the mind is attempting to conceptualize your experience. And if the mind comes in and tries to do that, we can just see, okay, that's the mind doing what it's been trained to do. And we can just see that for what it is. So right now, we're not trying to figure anything out. We're not trying to come to the right concept. We're just trying to see what remains when all the impermanent arisings get set aside for the moment. We can set aside any way we define ourselves, right? By our storyline, our history, our appearance, our gender, our career, our marital status, our financial status, where we live, what country we're born in, what race we are, any way we define ourselves as other than everything else. And we can set that aside. So we're not waiting for something, right? We're not waiting for something to happen. This isn't about the next experience. It's not about achieving peace. It's just a direct investigation, almost scientific in a sense. Okay, we're setting aside all the variables, all the impermanent stuff, and then see if there's anything that's not subject to coming and going. Not is there something that isn't impermanent? So the way to see that is just set aside everything that we can see as obviously impermanent. You know, our storyline changes, our appearance changes, our bodies change, our ideas change, our situation changes. All of that is subject to change. So we know that whatever it is that we are isn't that. So we haven't lost anything by setting that aside. And yet, when we set all of these things aside, there is something essential that remains, right? I mean, we're still here, still present. There's still a sense of beingness somehow without trying to define it or achieve it. You know, we can just acknowledge, yeah, I may not know what it is or how to name it or describe it to somebody, but there is a sense of, yeah, well, I'm whatever it is that I am is still here. Again, without defining it in any way, without hanging on to any philosophy, beliefs. This isn't about coming up with the right belief, the right philosophy, the right conceptual configuration of how the world is. It's just seeing what is here when everything that comes and goes is set aside. And we can just sense into, even when I forget about all of those things, and any other way I choose to identify myself or limit myself or conceptualize what I am. When we let all of that go, the astonishing thing is whatever it is that we are is still present. So we haven't achieved anything. We haven't actually altered anything. We've just come down to the essence, to the ground of being that was there all along. We just cleared away a little debris. So there's nothing actually that we need to do to enhance that. We can sense that it feels like it's in the vicinity of this body mind, right? But if we go to try to find the source of it, like I wonder at what point in this body mind is that, let's just call it awareness, where that originates from. And if we look in our head, you know, we can say, oh, okay, well, it seems like there's awareness there. And then if we drop down to our chest or belly, or even hands or feet, and sense in there seems to be an awareness or presence there as well. And if we can see that sense of awareness or consciousness or presence, whatever we choose to name it, or not name it at all, even better, can be located anywhere in the body that we choose to look. And then we could ask the question, well, is it then limited by my skin? In other words, on this side of my skin, it's present. On that side of my skin, it's absent. Can we say that with certainty? Or again, this isn't about coming up with the right conceptual answer. It's really sensing into what does it feel like in my body right now? What does it feel like? Does it feel more true that my awareness ends at my skin, or does it feel more true that it appears to be in the vicinity? And if we go looking for an edge of it, can we find an edge to it, a shape to it, an outside limit to it? Maybe it's not our skin, maybe it's, I don't know, 2 feet away from us, the end of our aura. Can we perceive that limit? Or is it more true to say, hard to say, it's that awareness can be experienced. It's not a thing that we experience, but we can sense that awareness being present, and we can allow ourselves just to explore the mystery of it. So it's not a conceptual thing. Oh yeah, awareness, I got it. It's like, what is it actually? What's the sense of it? What's the sense when we rest in that? Is it quiet? Is that awareness demanding more of this moment? The mind might be, right? But just the awareness, just the noticing. Does that noticing have any demands on this moment? Or is it just present for whatever arises in this moment? The next thought, the next sensation. So it's useful to notice that we didn't imagine this. We didn't create it. We didn't attain it. We don't manage it. But we can notice it. Notice what is already present. Always, 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 for all of us. But normally our mind is so busy trying to entertain us, come up with more stimulation, more ideas, more visuals, more experiences, that we miss what is already present. So we get captivated by the impermanent arisings and overlook what is always here. So this is the invitation, just to come back to this space often and spend some time there too. It's not a sterile space. I mean, sometimes it's described as nothingness or emptiness, which can sound, it can give it a discouraging kind of tone to it. But it's empty of what? It's empty of all the stuff we set aside, empty of all the stuff that we typically define ourselves by, empty of all the stuff that we fill our mental capacities with during the day. It's empty of all of that. So it's not exactly nothing. It's more like no thing, right? It's not a thing that we can stand back from and look at awareness. The mind can try to do that. You know, when the mind tries to look for awareness, it is the mind being firmly entrenched in our personhood, right? In our egos, trying to do something that it thinks will benefit itself. So it's not that, it's not the mind trying to grasp this concept of awareness or consciousness. It's just our innate ability to just step back into that space. Relax back into it. Let go into it. It's not something that we arrive at through mental conceptualization. Mental conceptualization is what we set aside, one of those things we set aside in order to see what's already there. So the invitation is just to come back to that space often throughout the day. You can do it much more quickly than we did tonight. You know, once it's been glimpsed, you can step into that in just a few moments. Just step back. Oh, yeah, still here, still present, still alive. That sense of beingness, still here. I may not know what it is. I may not be able to describe it, but it feels intimate. It feels as intimate as it could possibly be. So the more we come back to that, after a while, the mind will begin to relax about it. It may not happen overnight. Probably won't happen overnight. But it will, even when it's recognized, it may not be stable, right? We may see it for a short time, a few days, a few hours, maybe a month or two, and then it seems to recede. It feels like, oh, you know, I was awake for a while and then I lost it. And then we see it again. Then we try to hold on to it. And then it slips away again. So there can be that sense of coming and going. When we see it, it seems impossible that we'd ever not see it. It seems so obvious that we couldn't imagine losing sight of that. And then it may happen, we lose sight of it. But it hasn't gone anywhere. It's who we are. What happens is that our mind creeps back in any number of ways, convincing ourselves that, you know, maybe it wasn't real, maybe it was just sort of our imagination, maybe it wasn't the real awakening experience, not the real one. It was nice, but it wasn't the real one. Whatever our mind does to try to pull us back into its gravitational field. So I wanted to talk tonight about you know, dropping down from the head to the heart, but I want to spend a little time with this awakening at the level of awakening from our head, or waking up from our mental space. So normally the way we were taught, really taught by life, our parents advertising everything, almost everything that's ever happened to us growing up, was that there are experiences and sensations and that are to be had out in the world, you know, enjoyable, some not so much. But that's a function of the body being able to interact with the world, right? Through our senses. And we talked about that a few weeks ago, that we perceive ourselves out in this world, that the source of experience is somehow outside of ourselves, even though the perceptions are registered wholly within this body mind. So this is, you could say, the function of the body, to have these experiences interacting with the world around us. And then there's the mind, right? The mental thought processing mind. And so there we form ideas and beliefs and conceptions about the world, about ourselves, about who we are, ways we define ourselves. So these, in the mind, it's an attempt to find our place in the world, you could say. And we believe that by coming up with the right set of concepts, the right belief systems, reading enough books, having enough experiences, sort of putting it all together to make sense of the world and my place in it. The mind lives in an abstraction from our body's sensations of the world. We take the mind to be much closer to who we are. In fact, we often take it to be who we are, right? My ideas, I'll argue about them. I'll fight with someone about them. I'll go to war about them. I'll kill people for them, right? That's how strongly we believe that our ideas are reality. But all that mental conception is not reality. It's ideas about reality. It's at least one step removed from reality, right? If we take reality to be what is happening to our bodies, let's say out in the world, and then our mind tries to manage that experience, often making us feel good about it, bad about it, guilty about it, proud of it, belligerent about it, arrogant, angry, whatever, that thought, belief process generates in the body. Okay, so awakening at the level of mind is awakening from that belief that who I am is my ideas about myself, is the belief that I am separate from, everybody else, separate from this world. And normally, we've been presented often in spirituality as enlightenment is the one event, sort of the dividing line between unawake and awake. And after our awakening experience, life is forever blissful thereafter. An awakening experience can fundamentally transform our perspective about what we are and about life. It's the recognition of what we essentially are is not limited to this body mind. It's not limited. It's not defined in any way by our thoughts about ourselves. It's free of that, free of the conditioning of this body mind. By recognizing ourselves as that spaciousness, as that essence, as that awareness that is not subject to the comings and goings of the body and the mind, is immensely freeing. Doesn't mean that we can't think anymore. Doesn't mean that we forget our history. Doesn't mean that we can't perform, in our job, we lose our careers. It doesn't mean any of that, but it means that we're not controlled by any of those beliefs. We're no longer defined by our careers. We may still function in those careers, probably better because our sense of identity isn't so tied up in how we're perceived in those roles. You know, we can still think, but we're not controlled by the thought, because there's an awareness, there's a recognition that what we are is already free of that. Not that we've attained, not that we've escaped from the body-mind. We just recognize that we never were the body-mind. They're seeing through the misperception that what I am is limited to my thinking mind and this body. And we see, well, that's just not true, you know. So, I mean, it's, you know, the whole storyline about, you know, letting go of the ego, you know, sounds like a frightening prospect if that's what we take ourselves to be. You know, if I, you know, quite certain all these beliefs and ideas are true, and, you know, I sort of like my storyline, I've worked on it for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and I'm pretty good about how it's gone, more or less, not always, but not too bad. And, you know, I'm not sure I want to let that go. You know, well, maybe if it's for something better, like enlightenment or something, right? But it's not any of that. It's not the ripping away of ego. It's not, it's really seeing that it's just a misperception. It's not who we were. It's not who we ever were. You know, it's something that we concluded about ourselves based on what we were told, what the world appeared to be, you know, with our fascination with our thoughts and experiences and our desires and our fears. And so when we see through that, there's an immense sense of freedom. It's freedom from identification of the body-mind. It's freeing, it's liberating, it's wonderful. But it's not the end of the story. It's the end of seeking out of a sense of lack, right? That's that sense of lack or deficiency, or you know, I've got to improve my way out of this. That drops away. It drops away with the recognition of what we actually are. But again, it's not the end of the story. It's, yes, there's the recognition of transcendence from this body-mind. You know, I never was that. I imagined myself to be. I believed I was. But it turns out that you know, it's just a compilation of ideas and beliefs and history and experiences, etc. Okay, but that transcendence is the recognition that, no, all along, there was the sense of freedom from that, and unconditioned beingness. You could call it spirit if you want, if you don't try to define it, but just that sense of freedom as is. And as beautiful, sort of as pure as that experience can be, after a while, it might be a year or two when I say after a while, but after a while, there can be a sense of, yeah, but it feels free, but it feels a little dry. You know, it feels a little bit like removed from life itself, which feels really good at first. But then after a while, we sort of miss the creativity, the dynamic aspect of life, um, the enjoyment of these body minds. And so then the question becomes, how does this recognition of what I actually am, how does that move in this world? So, I mean, just that opening the door to come back into this world, to come back into being willing to experience life through this body mind, through these limitations, through these habits, faults, whatever we want to call them, quirks. It's like, I spent all those years maybe, trying to elevate myself out of that identification. And now there's this pull to come back into the body mind. There can be a resistance there, like, I'm not sure I want to open myself up to that. So you can find a lot of people that get stuck in this transcendent state, right? It's pure, it's in a sense safe. It can feel a bit aloof from life, right? Like I'm above the fray. I can't be touched. I can't be harmed. That's true, but it's not the end of the story. This life isn't about escaping from it. It's about finding out what we really are, and then how that awareness, beingness, how does that live this life? If it's so free, is it free enough to live through this body mind? And that's a whole different movement than the movement out from our identification with the conceptual thought, with identification with this body. That sort of a transcendent movement out, you could say, or elevated. Now we're coming back down into the nitty-gritty of life, but this time with the awareness of who we actually are. And so the question is, how does that live this life? And the rules are different. We find out that we're not able to live by moving the same way, out of the same willpower, out of the same ways of thinking that used to motivate us in the past. Maybe in the past we found ourselves motivated by ambition, respect, a little greed thrown in there, wanting more, wanting to be known, appreciated, whatever our thing is, finding more pleasure or power maybe. And then we find out that whatever was motivating ourselves in the past, unless it came from a really true space, it tends to drop away. And when we try to move from those old patterns, it just feels like there's no juice behind it. It's like, well, this used to excite me to go down this path, to explore, this experience or this relationship or, this pleasure. It doesn't seem to carry that same attraction anymore. And that can be really puzzling. We might also find that some of the, let's just say, shadow side of our personality or behavior or thought processes, might arise during this time. That's really puzzling. We can say to ourselves, well, wait a minute, I thought I was awake, and now, I find myself, getting angry again. How can that be? And, if we're not really honest with ourselves, we can try to keep that under the table. You may have seen that play out. So it's just this willingness to really open ourselves back up to the full experience of life, but from the perspective of knowing who we are. And when we begin to drop down into the sense of openness, receptivity to life, availability to life, to the next situation, the sense of it is that we're no longer operating up here. It's no longer a matter of ideas in the head. It feels like it is more heart-centered. You know, so we may find ourselves moving from a space that's other than our conceptual ideas about it. We're not moving from a desire to do things, you know, for our spiritual benefit, right? We've already transcended those mental-based ambitions, you know. But now, from a sense of just simple awareness, you know, how does that meet life? How does that meet the next situation? How does that meet my neighbor? How does that experience the world? You know, what do I choose to do? How does that move in the world? It comes from a new place, a different place, an unfamiliar place. And it takes a while to get used to how that moves through these bodies. At first, it can feel almost awkward, like I don't know what to say. You know, I don't know. I've lost my ability to be utterly convinced in my own concepts and beliefs. You know, that's a little odd. You know, I don't quite know how to act. Some of the people that I used to enjoy hanging out with, you know, just aren't that interesting to be around, you know. So I might find my situation changes. You know, if I was working at a job out of ambition and, you know, goal orientation to, I don't know, earn money and retire early or whatever our ambition might be, you know, we can just see that won't have the same pull as it may have had at one time. So as we drop down into this heart space, it's not something that we can do, right? It's something that we can allow. It's something that we can allow this consciousness to seek its own path, right? It's not something that we're managing. It's not something that we are trying to become more compassionate. Trying to become more compassionate, you know, is a fine practice. But what we're talking about here is when we know that our identity is firmly grounded in spirit, in awareness, then we're no longer operating out of concepts or ideas or beliefs or dogmas. You know, there's a recognition that the awareness that's functioning here is not other than the awareness that's functioning in and animating everything else. You know, so how do we interact with other people, you know, plants and animals on this planet, the river, the air, the earth? How do we interact with that when we know that it is not other than what we are? That's the sense of coming back into this heart space where we're available to really see the implications of consciousness, awareness. So from that space, it's no longer about trying to be compassionate as a practice. It's compassion is the only thing that makes sense. We're not doing it to be a good person, a spiritual person. We're not doing it to do the right thing. It's just, it would hurt to do anything other than that. Right? It's just the only way to move from that space that is in integrity with that awareness. You know, from that sense of awareness, what does love feel like? Right? You know, is it not this availability, this openness, this willingness to experience whatever shows up? Doesn't mean that we have to like everything that shows up. Some things we might prefer, sure, obviously. You know, I mean, I prefer a pat on the back than someone to hit my thumb with a hammer. You know, I prefer that. You know, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is just this availability to whatever shows up. You know, where there is no distinction. There's a wonderful quote by Meister Eckhart. I think it's about 13th century German Catholic bishop, well known, mystic, very talented. And he talks about that where distinction never gazed. It seems to have some relevance these days. Any distinction is mind-based. You know, it's not that we become unaware of, you know, the immense diversity in existence. It's not that we can't visually see that, right? But we can recognize that the essence is undifferentiated. There's one essence flowing through and as all living things. When that's truly seen, when the implications of that recognition are truly seen, it changes how we move in the world, right? And any deviation from that, from an authentic movement from that space, once it's recognized, is painful. It's just like the life saying, Matt, back on track here. So it's not like we get a free pass, right? Enlightenment doesn't give us the freedom just to do any old silly thing, you know, to fall back into ego. It's also a trap. We've also can see that detour played out, where someone sees that initial transcendence, thinks I'm free, I'm beyond harm, which is true, and therefore I can do anything that I want for my own benefit. So we've just come all the way back into falsehood again. So we can see that temptation, right? See that temptation to use what is true for ego's purposes. When we drop down into this heart space, this is where we let that tendencies to use it, you know, allow ego back in the door. It's a movement away from that. It's a movement into alignment with life. It's a movement where that openness isn't really under our control. You know, there's no payoff in trying to control that. There's no payoff in withholding love. Right? There's no payoff in being judgmental. No payoff in being unforgiving. Not because we should be, not because it's spiritually beneficial to us to be that, just because it doesn't make any sense anymore. And that's the openness. It can feel vulnerable, right? When we first step into that space, I mean, we can feel as naked as we've ever felt in our lives, where there's no armor left, that we're just available, right? And in the past, when we've been vulnerable to that extent, it can be a little, I mean, there can be some fear involved almost an unease, because when we've been that open in the past, it's very possible that we've been hurt, you know, hurt by someone who took advantage of that openness, that availability. So what allows us to be open, to be available in that way, is our recognition that what we are is beyond the body-mind, is already free, is already unconditioned, is already beyond the world's ability to harm it. So I'm not saying that we've never been harmed. I'm not saying that really awful things don't happen in the world. I'm saying that this awareness that we essentially are is as pure today, is as fresh, is as innocent as the day we were born. So that's the real, what's the ground of our being, but it's actually that sense of fearlessness comes from the recognition of that. It's, the fearlessness doesn't come from, you know, more armor. It is, the fearlessness is actually comes from complete vulnerability, because there's nothing left to be hurt. Because we don't, it's not that bad things may not happen to us, that difficult things, challenging things, health things, you know, physical attacks, death. I mean, those things might and will happen to this body-mind. But when there's a recognition that what we essentially are is beyond that coming and going, that's the freedom. That's the freedom to act fully in this world. That's the freedom to act open-heartedly. Again, not because it's a good thing or the right thing, it's because it's the only thing. You know, it's where, you know, love can express itself, where compassion can express itself, where fearlessness, where friendship, where kindness, you know, how that then moves in the world is of benefit in the world. It's not coming from an ego place of trying to change or improve the world to the way I see it. It's coming from a much, much deeper place than that. And that's the openness and vulnerability and spaciousness of that awareness dropping down into this body mind, into this heart space that is open. Not making it open, we're allowing that awareness to express itself through this body mind without the normal egoic limitations and filters and protections, and that openness is refreshing. That openness does have power. It seems delicate, but it has power, right? It has power in the world to just that openness. However it's expressed, it may be expressed creatively, it may be expressed, through a form of activism, it may be expressed through, simple things, gardening, taking care of a small child, writing, singing. I mean, there's many ways of expressing that movement, but when the source of it is that ground of being that we are, that movement has a flavor of authenticity about it. And that's appreciated by other people. This movement from the recognition of awareness being what we essentially are, which is sort of awakening at the level of mind, to awakening at the level of heart, is this open-heartedness. I've mentioned this before on retreat, but there's a symbolism in Catholicism, particularly, where Jesus is actually pulling open his chest to reveal his heart, right? That degree of vulnerability, Sacred Heart. So that's what we're talking about. That, again, isn't something that we can manage or create or do or, work our way towards. It's an allowing where that awareness drops into our heart, and it really breaks our heart open. Breaks it open to express what is, well, what is inexpressible, right? In whatever way it does, however that moves through your particular form. Beautiful.